Hi, my name is Brian Bottoms. I work here at the South Branch Columbus Library, and today we're going to do an introduction to painting tabletop miniatures. So today we're going to be painting some tabletop miniatures, and there are many different types of tabletop games, from your adventure games like Dungeons and Dragons, Vampire the Masquerade, to also your war type games such as Battletech. You also have Warhammer. And most of these games can be played with miniatures. A lot of these have great detail. Some you can have customized on a site called Hero Forge. And then they come and you can paint them yourself. I painted this one a few years ago. Of course, from storage, you see sometimes things break off, so you have to keep up with those to glue them back on. But this is a miniature that is fully painted through all the steps, from base to shade to seal. This is another previously painted miniature for Dungeons and Dragons. And these are a few for Battletech that are in different stages of painting. And this one right here, this has already been primed. Most of your miniatures are going to come in plastic, which can be normally white, gray, or black. Some come in metal, which is usually a pewter color. And almost all of them need to be primed. Some of them will come pre-primed, but I still like to spray primer on them just to make sure my paint sticks. So I'm going to start off with a demonstration on doing a base coat and a shade. Now, a few years ago when I painted these, you had to do your base coat first and then your shade. So I would have painted this all brown and then came back with this earth shade, because that will get in all the crevices. It's more liquidy. But recently, Citadel has come out with what they call the contrast paints. And this comes in very, very handy, because normally you would have to do 2 base coats, let it dry between your coats, and then do your shade, and then you can start doing your details. Where with the new contrast paints, it is a base coat and a shade in one. So I've done 2 coats on this. It's dried. I can now start going into my primary coats. Because once you do your base coats and your shade, then you start going into your layers, which is also a couple coats, and then that's when you start going into your details. So that's what we're going to cover today. We're going to definitely start off with the contrast paint for the base and the shade. We're also going to go over some of the layer paints, and I've already done some detailing on this gentleman, but I've been kind of using him for experiments for some of the new paints that I have. And so he's already in some different stages. And then I have some that are in the process of the old way that have already had their base coats, and I'm going to show the difference between having the base coat and having to use the earth shade, and then having one that is already wrapped up in one. And you do not have to buy the shades themselves. You can actually just take your paint and water it down. And I'll also do a demonstration on that. So to start off, this is a catapult from Battletech. It's an inner sphere mech. As you can tell, it has 2 very large missile launchers. And the great thing about the contrast paints is they do not have to be thinned like your normal base paint would be. You always just want to wet your brush a little bit when you're painting. And I normally use an old torn up t-shirt for this, because anything cotton, make sure it's cotton, will absorb the water and not leave lint on your brush. It's good to use a big brush like this. You can get brushes for fairly cheap at any of the craft stores, any of your local shops that have things like that, have a craft section. As you can see, this goes on kind of liquidy. It's very loose, and what it does is it gets in all the grooves, but then it dries even. And you could probably make one of these yourself by not watering your paint down as much to be a shade. But I'm sure they have a few tricks up their sleeves that they add to it that make it a little more stable and work probably a little bit better than what you or I could make at home. But most of the things you see the companies that make the paints come out with is because somebody was doing this at home and came up with the idea first. And you do not have to buy paint specifically for miniatures. You can get your basic craft paints, and sometimes those are definitely the ones I use. Any of your acrylic paints will work great. Just some of these you have to water down more. I'm just making sure I got all the tiny crevices, and I'm not doing the base because it will be a different color. And it'll end up being what is called fraught, where fake grass or dirt's put on there. Do any touch-ups I may see. Need to loosen that up just a little bit. Paint's getting a little thick. And as you can see, had I glued the Atlas or the Catapult to the top, it would be much easier to manipulate and paint. And as you can see, the shade is still not completely dry. So the main difference, and the reason I like the contrast paint so much, and I haven't tried to make one myself, you probably could, but instead of having to do 2 coats of a base, then do my shade, because you have to allow it to fully dry between each base coat, then fully allow your shade to dry, and then start your layers, which you also have to allow to fully dry between coats. Saves a lot of time, saves money on paint. One thing I like, especially if you're doing anything for jewels, like I used it for the top of this wizard's staff, and then also I use it for the cockpits of my mechs. As you can see, that's just a little bit shinier. And that is because I used what is called a jewel paint. And that is done, this one was done with Soulstone Blue. So I painted with silver up under that and then coated it so it kind of gives a nice glossy. So when I do go to seal this, the majority I will do with a flat seal, and I will do a glossy seal on that so it keeps that shine. And one of the main things about details is you have very, very small areas like this. That would be a, what's called an SRM-4, where 4 missiles will launch out of there. For something like that, I have a very particular paintbrush. It's very small. I just got it from the craft store, and it works great. I also use this if I'm painting eyes and cockpits. Getting a little more detail, this is when it gets a little more advanced. You can see I use the jewel paint on the eyes on this wizard. And this is just a good example of working from in to out with your details. I also used jewel paints on the fasteners. You can see the red on the buttons. And the gold color is from dry brushing. And an example of dry brushing I'll actually show on this mech right here, because when you have ridges, it will help bring them out more. So I have a brush that is great for dry brushing. You want one that's kind of stiff. And this is one of the times you will not thin your paints. Because dry brushing, you're just barely putting it on there. And this is another reason an old cotton t-shirt would come in handy, because you try to get most of your paint off. And then when you come back through, It gives it a little bit of a highlight. You want to go darker with your washes. And it's hard to see except for right here, especially with the state this one's in, not being fully completed. But you can see it kind of adds a little bit of a look like wear. Like this isn't a, you would expect a robot being used out in space for whatever reason it's being used. It's gonna have a little bit of wear on the paint, and that's what you can use this to do. There are many tutorials that you can find online for information on painting. A lot of them will be much better than mine and provide more detailed information. I really enjoy painting miniatures almost as much as I enjoy playing the tabletop games. Just make sure if you're playing any kind of war type game, you really like painting, and make sure you do them in batches. And I hope everyone has a nice day and enjoy painting your miniatures.